Hello and welcome to CineMaine, where we take a look at films that are connected to Maine, whether they be set in Maine, filmed in Maine, or have any other loose connections to the state of Maine. And today we are looking at the action thriller The Boondock Saints, written and directed by Troy Duffy. The basic premise of this film involves two Irish twin brothers, Connor and Murphy McManus, who experience an epiphany together in a shared dream, motivating them to become local vigilantes who set out to eradicate Boston's criminal underworld in the name of the Lord. All in the midst of pursuit by FBI agent Paul Smecker. So as you can tell from that premise, this film's primary connection to New England is its Boston setting, on top of the majority of the film being primarily filmed on location. What connects this film specifically to Maine isn't so much any scenes that are set or filmed in Maine, but rather through the featuring of Maine-based stand-up comedian Bob Marley in a supporting role as Detective David Greenlee, who winds up reluctantly aiding Smecker in his pursuit of the Saints. Marley not only grew up in Bangor before moving to Portland, but also attended college at the University of Maine's location in Farmington. While he did live in California for a while after attending UMF, he did move back to Maine in his late 30s and has stayed local ever since. He's more well known for his work as a stand-up comedian than he is for his acting. In fact, he only has 3 other credits in his acting filmography, one of those being reprising this very role in this film's sequel. His character is very much a comic relief character who spends a good chunk of the time stating the obvious, in comedic fashion of course, and much to the annoyance of Agent Smecker. Greenlee does occasionally have useful things to say, however, like when they're investigating the murder of a gangster played by Ron Jeremy.
And that's what they had in common. They're all bad guys. Now they're all dead bad guys.
As well as later on in the film when Smecker is investigating another incident that occurred in a suburban area. Smecker believes that 6 guys with guns caused this shootout, but Greenlee has a surprisingly astute epiphany.
What if it was just one guy with 6 guns?
Overall, I really like his role in this film. In a movie that's already designed to have a lot of funny moments throughout, he does a good job at being a comic relief character without being too over the top or one-dimensional. He's still able to be very funny like he is in his stand-up, but is also very believable as this detective reluctantly aiding Smecker while investigating the murders of these mafiosos. I can see why he came back in this film's eventual sequel. In fact, the acting in this film as a whole is excellent, and a good chunk of the characters are quite likable and have great chemistry with one another. Sean Patrick Flannery and Norman Reedus are both excellent as fraternal twins Connor and Murphy McManus, who go on a mission from God to eradicate the wicked mobsters who roam the streets of Boston. You really buy the sibling camaraderie that these two have, and they feel like brothers who have known each other their whole lives and have stuck together through a lot. I also like how these two are very quick-witted when it comes to speaking different languages, are very skillful with the equipment they use to apprehend the criminals they're after, and know how to cover their tracks and remain inconspicuous. David Delarocco is also great as David Delarocco. Well, who would have guessed? Okay, but all joking aside, he has really good chemistry with Flannery and Reedus. He plays a former henchman of the film's main villain, Papa Joe Iacovetta, who ends up helping the Saints after being set up. He has funny moments like a lot of characters in this film do, but he's also kinda tragic in a way. You kinda pity the dude for being used and at some points even psychologically tortured by the criminals he used to work for, and you can tell he wants to help the McManus brothers accomplish their mission once he finds out what they're up to. Even though admittedly when he tries his own hand at doing what they do, you can tell he's a lot sloppier at it than they are. But he is still able to help the Saints out by giving them information he has on the people they're after. So even though he's a bit inept, occasionally does questionable things, and is even kinda mentally unstable at times, he's still not entirely useless. There are even characters who don't get a lot of screen time but still leave quite an impression, such as the pub owner with Tourette's at the beginning of the film. While he's only in the movie during the first act, his character has a very likable and endearing nature, and the movie does a good job making his comedic moments funny without being demeaning or insulting, which could have been a very easy thing to screw up. Billy Connolly is fantastic as the boy's father Noah, aka Il Duce. He's cast against type as an infamously ruthless assassin who, after being imprisoned for many years, is hired by Papa Joe to go after the Saints, only for him to end up assisting them instead upon the realization of who they were this whole time. His introductory scene is beautifully over the top, and the way he's described makes him feel like a boss battle character in a video game. Though his screen time may be minimal, he's quite an intimidating presence. And the scene of him reuniting with his sons after realizing they were the assassins he was hired to go after is incredibly touching without going too overboard in its sentimentality. These characters may not interact a lot throughout the movie, but you can definitely tell that the apple did not fall far from the tree. And it feels great to see him aid his sons during the film's last 10 minutes. But by far my favorite character in this film has to be Agent Smecker, played brilliantly by Willem Dafoe, in what might be one of my favorite performances of his, if not my absolute favorite. He does a fantastic job fully embracing his role in this film. Smecker easily could have been written to feel like a stereotype considering both some of his character traits and the time period this film was made during, but luckily he manages to feel like a fully fleshed out character. That is to say that while his character is gay, he doesn't feel completely defined by this character trait like a lot of gay characters in movies and shows back then were. He's also very sharp-witted, to the point where the McManus brothers themselves acknowledge so, has a no-nonsense attitude, has such a way with words, like Defoe's character in The Lighthouse did.
I'd like to thank whichever one of you donut-munching, barrel-assed, pod-pulling sissies leaked this to the press.
His way of investigating crime scenes is unconventional, but leads to very astute observations. And you can also tell that there's a duality he has the further he goes into his investigation of what these men are doing. Both the writing and Defoe's performance do a great job bringing these aspects to life. The best example of this is this scene where Smecker is hungover and in a confessional booth talking to a priest. While him being hungover in a confessional booth in and of itself is very comedic, the conversation he has with said priest is actually quite fascinating and even a little profound. Despite being completely unaware that the Saints and Rocco were already in there with the priest, Smecker tells him about the dilemma he's having with his pursuit of these guys. You can tell the only thing he really wants to do is be true to himself and do what he believes to be the right thing. Yet he's torn between that and his obligation to what his job requires, upholding the law, which he feels in this instance goes against what his gut is telling him, which is that what these men are doing is surprisingly necessary. Scenes like this not only help his character feel incredibly fleshed out, but also help the movie as a whole feel like more than just a mindless yet entertaining action flick, and do help the film as a whole feel more thought-provoking when compared to other films in its genre. Another aspect of this movie I really like is how eclectic and versatile the music is. The musical score, of course, includes Gaelic music composed by Jeff Donna, fitting in with the Irish aspects of the film, along with some choir music fitting in with the film's religious themes. But there's also a great deal of different kinds of hard rock music in this film as well. The music that plays during the bar fight during the first act has kind of a Rage Against the Machine type of vibe going for it. The music that plays in Agent Smecker's entrance reminds me of some cheesy 80s hair metal licks you'd hear in a lot of cop movies and shows from the late 80s and early 90s. The music that plays during Il Duce's ambush reminds me of the funk metal genre. And in one scene where Rocco enters a restaurant in an attempt to do the kind of thing that the McManus brothers are doing, there's a song that plays that, for the longest time, I thought was a Perfect Circle song. But upon researching the music of this film, I came to find it's actually from a band that writer-director Troy Duffy was the lead guitarist and main songwriter for, called The Brood, who changed their name to the Boondock Saints when they released their album Release the Hounds in 1999. I'm pretty sure the similarities to A Perfect Circle's music is completely coincidental, since A Perfect Circle's debut came out just a few months after this movie did. But still, I highly recommend checking their music out if you're an A Perfect Circle fan like I am. On top of all of that, there's also a great deal of contemporary techno and electronica tracks of that era in this film, which I'm sure may have been a choice influenced by the success of The Matrix. Speaking of Matrix similarities, while this movie gets a lot of comparisons to Quentin Tarantino's films due to this movie's tone, it's worth noting that this movie came out only less than a year after The Matrix did. That film left such an impact on pop culture and action films in general that a lot of movies tried to recreate what that film did due to its success. While I'm sure that any similarities between this film and The Matrix are also a complete coincidence, it is fun to see the similarities. That being that a lot of action scenes in both films utilize slow motion in very clever ways. And in the case of this film, my favorite usage of slow motion has to be early on, where Connor McManus throws a toilet seat down onto a Russian mobster who's attacking his brother Murphy in an alleyway. To me, this is a perfect combination of juvenile, humorous, and badass all in one. Speaking of this film's action sequences, something I noticed upon revisiting this film is that a good chunk of the action scenes are actually presented to the viewer in the past tense. It usually starts with Smecker and other officers showing up to a crime scene, followed by Smecker piecing together what he believes went down, going back and forth between the Saints taking down the criminals, and Smecker visually reenacting what he believes to have occurred. In one instance, he's even edited next to the Saints using his fingers as pretend guns while the Saints are taking care of business. I can't really think of any other movie that's handled its action scenes in that manner narratively, and I feel that this also helps this film stand out from a lot of other films in its genre. The only major thing about this film I don't like is this one scene where the McManus twins and Rocco are staying up late, getting drunk and hanging out. While these three actors are great in this scene, let's just say that if you're a cat person like I am and have seen this film before, you know exactly why I don't like this scene. I'll just leave it at that. Not to mention that this scene also kind of makes these characters look dumb for fiddling around with weapons in their arsenal while sitting around and drinking. I gotta say, not a smart moment. But the movie as a whole, on the other hand, I really enjoyed. It's honestly a miracle that the film is as good as it is, considering not only that it came from a then first-time screenwriter and first-time director, but also considering its troubled production history. There's actually an entire documentary called Overnight that covers this very subject. So I am going to recommend checking that film out if you want to know more, but for the sake of this video, I'm going to keep it brief. Basically, this film's script was initially picked up at Miramax in March 1997. After winning a bidding war against the studio that, ironically, would later go on to own half of Miramax today. But Miramax ended up dropping the project altogether the following December. For a while, it didn't even look like the film was going to get made until Franchise Pictures stepped into finance. Once they rescued the film, they also gave Duffy more creative freedom over the project, such as allowing him to cast his choices for the McManus brothers and Agent Smecker. While the film initially got a very limited theatrical release just a couple of weeks into the new millennium, subsequent screenings funded by Blockbuster, which had been exclusively selling VHS tapes and DVDs that 20th Century Fox distributed, helped the film gain a massive cult following over time. So much so that Duffy later made a sequel coming out almost a decade after the original. I have to admit, it's not hard to see why this film has a cult following. What is hard for me to see, however, is why this film apparently got really bad reviews from critics. Granted, I am used to genuinely liking a lot of movies that critics seem to crap on, but I've met lots of people over the years who've seen this movie before, and I have yet to hear anyone say that they dislike it. But then again, I am aware that the audience score on Rotten Tomatoes is far more reasonable than the critic score. And despite how much I enjoy this movie, even I can admit it's not for everyone. If you're not a fan of films with hardcore violence, particularly if it's used hand in hand with religious symbolism at times, then my guess is you're probably not gonna get into this movie all that much. But if you don't mind those things and are a fan of action movies, comedies, stories that deal with themes such as justice versus vengeance and things like that, then I highly recommend giving this one a watch. This movie may have come very close to never seeing the light of day, but I, for one, am glad that it did. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like and subscribe, and also be sure to check out CineMaine's website and be on the lookout for future CineMaine content.